Hello and welcome to today's panel discussion at Freelance Business Week. We are going to be talking about the PRO Act. I am Julie Cortez, copywriter by day, freelance rock star by night, and I will be your trusty moderator for today's discussion. I would like to introduce you to our esteemed panel today. Joining me are Jean Zaino, founder and executive chairman of MBO Partners, Matthew Mottola, co-founder and CEO of Venture L, and he's also a Forbes contributor. As I'm going to mess this up, Azaria. Thank you, Lehman, Chief Administrative Officer for iWorker Innovations, and of course, Evan Armstrong, VP of Government Affairs for the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have a lot of questions on tap. So that said, viewers, those of you who are tuning in, if you have a question that you'd like answered, go ahead and put it in the chat and I will try to get to those as time allows. So let's dive in. Before the pandemic hit, the number of people freelancing in America was on a steady incline, with numbers expecting to be well over 50% of the United States workforce by the year 2027. My personal hunch now is that with COVID and many people losing their jobs, we're probably going to reach that number much sooner. However, there's certain legislation currently being considered that could threaten the livelihoods of millions of American freelancers. This legislation is called the PRO Act. All eyes are on this bill, as a similar law went into effect last year in California and wreaked all sorts of havoc, leaving both the self-employed as well as the companies that hire them in all sorts of a bind. The bill is now being considered on a national level. It has already passed in the House, that was done back in March, and it's now in the hands of the Senate. So I'd like to turn it over to you all on the panel, and let's first explain to our viewers, especially for those who don't know, what is the PRO Act? What does the PRO stand, and what is the intent of the Act? Who'd like to go first?
I can jump in, Julie, and give a background. It's consuming my day-to-day life as a lobbyist the last several months. So I can give the folks a little bit of a background. The PRO Act, which stands for the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, is simply a list of favored policies for organized labor to amend the National Labor Relations Act and associated statutes to make it easier to organize individual workers against employers. Simply put, the bill expands the tools and the activities that are allowed by an organizing campaign, and it limits the tools and the activities that an employer can use to fight back against an organizing campaign. So the latest example is what we saw in the news in Alabama with the Amazon union drive election, where the voters rejected the organizing drive 2-1. So Amazon, of course, fought back and provided information to their employees about the union drive. The union organizers argued for their side, and then the election happened. The PRO Act would fundamentally alter the process that we saw in the Amazon case, for the purpose of making it easier for the union drive to be successful. So the PRO Act includes the ABC test, which is similar to the test we saw in AB5 in California, but it does 20 or 30 other things to amend current law that, again, would drive more union success. So that's a little bit the long and the short of it. I could go on more, but I won't. But that's about it.
Thank you. So for those who didn't catch that, so the PRO is an acronym, actually. So it means protecting the rights to organize. And while the main intent of the PRO Act is to strengthen unions and encourage workers to organize, the legislation contains verbiage that people are really worried about that would wipe out independent contractors as we know it. And then also compel companies, those who hire us, to reclassify contractors as employees. So in particular, as Evan mentioned, there's a lot of concern over the ABC test language that's in the proposed bill. This is a 3-pronged test that is to be met for a worker to be considered an independent contractor. Otherwise, they'd be considered an employee eligible for benefits. So I want to read real quick for the audience to ensure we don't miss anything exactly how this current AB test is written. It reads that this is an individual performing any service shall be considered an employee and not an independent contractor unless, here's letter A, the individual is free from control and direction in connection with the performance of the service, both under the contract for the performance of service and in fact, letter B, the service is performed outside the usual course of the business of the employer, and letter C, the individual is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, profession, or business of the same nature as that involved in the service performed. Now, from what I've been seeing online and in news resources and whatnot, there doesn't seem to be much concern over letters A and C. However, with letter B, that seems to be the one that most people are worried about. Matthew, let me turn to you. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so just to clarify, B is you can't do work that's considered usual core of the business, right? That's exactly what a freelancer does, and that's exactly the way that it's shifting. And so if you look at sort of what I had done at Microsoft was, instead of having a 50-person org, we just needed 50K a budget and to go hire out, 15 to 30 different freelancers. But those freelancers were doing what would be considered core work. They were doing design, they were doing development, they were doing writing. And so this bill overnight would make that illegal. And the reason this is so, impactful is because net of the law, it's the perception. And Microsoft did get sued a big amount of money in early 2000s for misclassification, and that still looms over the enterprise. Net of what a law says, purely a can we get sued for working with you freelancers?
Very good. We've got a question that popped up in the chat. It says, what about the defined exempted professional categories that are defined in the California ABC test that would likely also be a part of this as well? Do you not feel this would be enough protection? And then there's more. For most freelancing professionals to keep doing what they're doing uninterrupted?
Yeah, so if I can answer that one real quick. So it's not the law that matters, it's the perception. And so even if they're exempted, it's the fact that now just to hire you freelancers, it's going to take so much legal bills to do it, which a company then says, you put it blunt, screw it, we don't want to do that. And so within a company, just getting a company to be able to spend on IP, intellectual property, is in itself a major milestone, and laws like this just simply block that and say, instead of going with freelancers, we'll just go to the agency that we've already used.
Yeah, I think, Matthew, I think that's a great point. The chilling effect, I think, is immense for something like the AB5, even though there are exemptions. I think the most pernicious thing about it is an overreaching law, and then folks had to lobby for their own exemptions, whereas this group is a bunch of independents that want to do the work they want to do. And it's sort of an affront to that ideology to go ask the government for the option to do that, right? I think that's the most pernicious thing. And so the PRO Act does not have any exemptions, but you could foresee a similar process where you have to lobby the federal government simply for working the way you want to work.
Right. And that just contributes to a pay to play kind of mentality, which is really, really bad. Like you said, Evan, to have lobbyists basically manage who should be able to be exempt from this rule or not. And my feeling is anytime you create a one size fits all policy like this for something as central to people's life as work, that's really problematic.
Yeah, and I would add to that, by way of example, what we saw in California, authors. This was a huge issue for authors and contributors because, Matthew probably knows so much about this. They stated that if any one person, an independent worker, submitted more than 35 submissions to the same company in a year, that person would then be considered an employee. And that was what was proposed. And the issue with that is for writers, of course, many of them work for so many different companies. And part of that, which we'll get into a little bit later, I think with those types of limitations, you also limit so much cultural diversity by allowing different writers to write for different sources and papers. And so there's so many different unintended consequences as well that go into some of these regulations that they're trying to impose.
Yeah, and if I could add too, I mean, we were talking to one of the largest tech companies in the world a week ago, and we found out that they're actually already avoiding California freelancers. And it's deeper than just that company. It's the advisors that they have telling them don't hire California freelancers. And where this gets really scary is that, as the US, we don't live in a vacuum. And so it's not like freelancers aren't going to get hired. It's just US freelancers that aren't going to get hired, which is the scariest part of this bill.
Yeah, a lot of people are considering the proposed law a federal version of California's Assembly Bill 5 or AB 5, as you all have mentioned. Jean, I'm curious to your thoughts on this. Like, do you see this being equal, or do you see it being different on the national level?
Everything I hear, Julie, is that it will be AB 5 on a federal level. And like I think Evan was just saying, or Matthew, there'll probably be carve-outs, but they'll be done by lobbyists, and we'll have our federal government deciding on who's a winner and who's a loser. I think that the fact that there's so many people that want control of their lives and control to do the work they want to do the way they want to do it. Is it's important to not take freedoms away, this is what this is going to do. And I agree, the fact that it's the chilling effect is the perception. People don't know when things are vague or there's a fear, they just won't hire freelancers. And I think the intention of this law, which certainly in California it was, that companies would instead just hire these freelancers as employees and give them benefits, which sounds really nice, but that's not what happened. Freelancers got fired. Freelancers that were supporting their family could no longer do it. And there's reasons why our current workforce has moved to much more of a higher growth of independence, because it's really fractionalizing your workforce and also fractionalizing who you work for. Not everybody wants to work for the same person, the same manager, and be vulnerable to M&A or some manager they don't want to work for. And with more and more work being digital, geography is not as important, and people can have 3, 4, 5 clients, which is a great way to manage and be in control of your career. So AB 5 in California, I think there's 12 exemptions now. And it's clear that when you have to have so many exemptions to a law, that something was wrong with it. It wasn't intended to do that.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of pros and cons to this PRO Act as it's currently written, and there are definitely strong opinions on both sides of the equation about what would it affect and what wouldn't it affect. I'm curious to throw it back to you all, what do you see as being the pros of this act, if there are any?
I'll take the first one. I don't find many positives in the bill. I think the rhetoric that's used to promote it is a little misleading. When you get into the details of the bill, you see that at its core, its provisions within the bill are to make it easier for organizing to occur. Now, theoretically, and the proponents would say that helps workers. But in the process of making it easier to organize, it takes away things like right to a secret ballot in an election, which is a fundamental democratic principle. It takes away the employee's ability to hear an opposing view from the employer, which many employees actually want. They want to hear two sides of a story, have an informed choice, and then make their choice at the ballot box, which is exactly what you saw in the Amazon case last week. There's charges that the employer, Amazon in this case, was putting out propaganda, but they're simply stating a case that they believe they were making a value to their employees and the union was not. And then the employees voted. This bill takes away that entire process. And I do think that's fundamentally harmful to workers. I think we can all agree that workers should be protected, should have benefits, should be supported. And I think that's a universalism that we all have, but the bill in and of itself does not actually achieve that. It ultimately harms them.
Yeah. I'm sorry, let me add to that real quick. This is interesting because from an employee perspective, I understand some of their rationale, right? But we're talking about the independent workforce. Fundamentally, the issue that I see with this is that it's based on a false premise, for one thing. So we know that conflict brings change. We also know that sometimes those outcomes, and most of those times, those outcomes are up to us. In this case, the knee-jerk reaction is to go back to what we've always known. We know that unions have fallen to less than 10% participation, so that's a problem for them. So then there's this assumption that, and this was the without getting political, the current administration stated that more than 60 million people would become union members if given the choice. My question is based on what? The other reason why it's based on a false premise is because a lot of the numbers that they use are based on a very, very small percentage of the independent workforce. I had a discussion, I spoke at the University of Michigan last spring, and this same topic came up. Everyone continues to look, from a media perspective at least, at app-based and platform-based drivers, but the spectrum of independent workers is so much larger than that. So while it may be true that a small percentage of app-based or platform-based drivers would appreciate this, I don't think that it's a representation of the entire workforce. So the false premise from the beginning is the issue. And here's the thing, from a cultural perspective, the union, we're not anti-union. Probably none of us would say we're anti-union. I appreciate unions. My grandfather was part of a union, and it was great for our family. I appreciate that. I love that. Here's the thing, it worked for that time. It worked for that demographic. It worked under that cultural zeitgeist. That's not our reality today.
So who started this idea and who exactly does it benefit?
Yeah, so if I could add here, there's three parties that we have to look at. And the first principle is that there's $1.2 trillion of GDP that we're talking about, and it's going to turn into $2 trillion of GDP. So that's the first principle, right? There's a lot of money that is going to get redistributed. The three parties is it'll help government, it'll help large companies, and it'll help intermediaries, staffing solutions, and freelance platforms. It'll help government because they have tax and they can better control where these people are. It'll help large companies because now these employees that are leaving are going to have to come back to them. And it'll help the freelance platforms because now they have to be the intermediary layer that takes the insurance policies and takes the advisement, which is why you see a lot of freelance platforms. They've said nothing, right? Why would they? This is going to be a $1.2 trillion redistribution to them.
Fascinating. Anybody else have any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think the number one reason behind this bill, quite honestly, in addition to what Azaria just said regarding the unions, it's about the money. And the government loves large employers because it could control the payroll taxes. And you could penalize the CFO and the general counsel of large companies and hold them accountable to make sure that every paycheck is having taxes withheld and deposited to the state and local and federal government. With independent contractors, quite honestly, it's very difficult for the government to manage who's paying their taxes and who isn't. Now, I've been working with independents for over a decade, and we've been doing a lot of research with the state of independence in America. And I will tell you that our experience is the overwhelming majority of independent contractors and freelancers want to do the right thing, and they do try to pay their taxes. Now, it's complicated, and sometimes there's mistakes. But I believe one of the biggest motivations behind this bill is to collect taxes.
Okay.
Interesting. So, Azaria, you brought up an interesting point when we're talking about rideshare drivers. And I would say that there's a big difference between freelancers who are rideshare drivers and those who work in, let's say, the advertising and marketing space. Mm-hmm. Do you think that industries ought to be considered individually or separately from one another? Should certain job roles or functions be held exempt from this law should it come to fruition?
That's an interesting question. the reason why I would say no, this is just off the cuff, would be because then we start getting into all these fine-tuned areas of exemptions. And realistically, then we must go back and look at the overall premise. Something's wrong if we have to come up with 100 different exemptions for one rule or one law.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that. That, you know, if you're going to restructure or reformulate our workforce laws that were created in the 30s to fit sort of the paradigm as we've talked about for now, it has to be an inclusive approach. You can't have laws that are just for rideshare, laws that are just for delivery, laws that are just for freelancers. Yeah, I think it has to be hinged on the idea that individuals choose what they want, and we should promote and support those choices with the law. And I think that allows for the most variables and the most innovation to occur, whereas the binary choice that we created in the 30s has stuck us in this sort of mode of you're either an employee or not, and we have no other alternative. So I think we have to view the future going forward in a variety of ways, in a diversity of ways that are extremely inclusive to how people want to live and work.
I have to laugh because I want to tell a quick story. I was thinking of my grandfather, who was just this amazing Southern gentleman. He retired from General Motors, part of the pension and all the other things. And I remember I wanted to be an artist, and he said, well, you can't do that. You never make a living being an artist. And at the time, it was when graphic arts and design was becoming very popular. I probably would have been fine, right? But I remember he looked at me and he said, no, you got to get yourself a good job with a pension. And that was the way they thought. And now I think it's interesting. You see all of these, people stating, like, there's like jokes going around. Even people who were employees, they're like, we're not going back in the office, right? So they're seeing kind of this is a whole cultural change that needs to be embraced, not pushed away.
Well, Jean, you've done a lot of work with the state of independence in America. So this all begs the question, what does this mean for freelancers in the future of work? Like, where have we been? Where are we heading? And what sort of impact could the PRO Act have on independent workers?
Well, I believe that efficiency and the right things will happen. And there's just a strong trend towards people understanding and at some point in their lives want to do independent work, either, when they're trying to do something that's creative, or at a later part of their career where they don't want to, work in a traditional job and they want to kind of leverage their network and their experience and do project work while they travel and do other things. And so there's a tremendous trend, and over the 10 years that we've done this research, every year we would ask the same question. And one of the questions we would ask is, do you feel safer being in a full-time job or in independence? And when we did this back in 2011, 33% of the people would say they feel more secure as an independent contractor because they had a diversified income stream. The most recent survey we did, which was in 2020 last year, that number for the first time crossed 50%. It was 51%. So over the years, actually people feel today more secure having control over their career instead of some organization that could be subject to competition, to reorganization, to an M&A, to someone they don't really want to work for. It's a way of life. So I think the future of freelancing and independence is absolutely going to continue and going to thrive. Now, will it reach, is probably going to end up at 50-60% of the workforce. There'll always be the need for a full-time core workforce. It's actually a great way for people to learn, how to work and how to be in business. But I believe at some point in everyone's career, at some point they will be doing an independence. And, I think this problem of employee versus independent contractor has been an ongoing problem. Even before AB5, there was something called the Borello test, which gave a little bit more freedom of judgment. But I think ultimately there needs to be a certification for an individual to be a freelancer so they could opt out of any of these laws. So if they understand, hey, I understand what it means to be a freelancer. I understand I got to provide my own work. I got to do my own thing. I don't get access to my employer's or clients' benefits. And at that point, they could go off and do what they want to do, and their clients don't have to be worried about this chill factor or fear. So I do think there's going to be a solution. I just think it's, for the first time now, it's hitting mainstream, which is a good thing because it's part of a general discussion.
Gene, that's a really interesting point about the accredited freelancer. It's kind of like an accredited investor, right? Where you sign and you say, I acknowledge that I don't have benefits. I'm going to have a roller coaster income stream, and I accept that. So the three things I would say for freelancers, the first is you got to get professional. So you do have to have either an LLC or an S Corp or whatever it is. And this is actually a global trend. In the UK, it's called IR35. The second thing is you got to build very tight relationships, because what this does do is it forces you to have strong relationships as a vendor. And it's really tough to get in as a vendor contract when you're a freelancer. The third thing, though, which I do think is the most important, is we do have to go global. And what I mean by that is even if the US F's up, guess what? Singapore wants to hire you. The UK wants to hire you. You're still in very much so demand, but you have to think outside of, our two oceans. So those are sort of the three main things. And being professional is, I'd say, the number one thing right now you have to make sure you're ready for.
Absolutely. A responsible, independent freelancer should have their choices to do whatever they want to do and not be forced into employment or certainly a union.
Great discussion here. And we've got a lot of questions coming in the door about people asking, does an LLC provide any sort of cover? Is this going to force sole proprietors to restructure as an LLC or to create partnerships? Is this really the end to freelancing as we know it?
Well, an LLC, is actually a highly recommended approach as a single member LLC. It doesn't really require much effort to manage your taxes differently. You still file a Schedule C. I do think part of what Matthew was just saying, you got to be professional. You got to be a business. You're a business of one. And today it's so easy to do that. And there's tools out there, there's, email's easy. You set up your website, you get your insurances, but you need to be a business. And at that point, that does set up a lot of protections. And there's tremendous, financial benefits of doing that. Certainly with the current tax law, there's if you're generating under a certain level of income, about 150,000, or if you're married to 300,000, you actually get a 20% reduction off your income, qualified business income. So there's benefits to it, but you need to professionalize, and I definitely think that's the case.
Is that just the simple answer to all of this, that anybody who doesn't have an LLC structure, go out and get one?
No, because you still have to follow those rules. You got to not be overly controlled by your client. You need to not be overly dependent on one employer. I mean, you need to be a business. You need to have multiple clients. You need to have the right structure, and you need to understand what rights you're giving up and what responsibilities you're taking on. I think I often think about the Small Business Administration, who for whatever reason doesn't pay attention to this very much. But if the Small Business Administration really wants to help small business, this is the smallest business you can get, and there's 40 to 50 million of them out there. So education's important, and helping people know what it is that they need to do to be a responsible independent.
And I would say, even under the B prong, if you've done all your work to build this professional business, if you're in the same core business, that ABC test will destroy you.
That's right. In fact, we have a lot of clients that, just like I think was even Evan or Matthew said, their advisors are just telling them, We don't know the law. We don't know what's going to happen. It's too new. Case law is going to take years to figure this out. Just don't use them. Don't hire them in those states. And because, the B section of the test says if any employee is doing the work of the freelancer, they need to be an employee, which is insane. So it's really, if you're a technology company and you bring on a developer as a freelancer, you technically need to make them an employee. Maybe you could hire someone to paint your ceiling or fix your plumbing, but you can't hire and engage a freelancer that is doing any of the similar type of work as anyone in your employ.
And Gene, if I could add to your point too, I mean, it also goes beyond just having an LLC. It's being able to service what that client needs. And so the largest problem that I've had in working, especially with Fortune 50s and 500s, is that when you find a good freelancer, you want to stay with that freelancer. And I might not need your service right now, but I need you to still own the contract and own the relationship. Because your clients, when you start getting upstream and you start upselling and getting large projects, they don't want to work with a million freelancers. They want to work ideally with one of you, just like they want to have only one direct report or 5 to 10.
Yeah.
And that is the biggest opportunity for you as a freelancer to go head to head against an agency and to actually be able to scale. Because I've seen companies spend up to $100 million on us, but it's not going to get done if it's just a million individual freelancers.
So in these large enterprises, there's a big trend going on right now called direct sourcing. And I would encourage everybody to learn a little bit about it. So most large companies today are trying to build their own relationships, Matthew, like you just said, with a known community of freelancers they could engage directly without going through an intermediary. And a staffing company, or they don't need to pay for those excess, recruiting costs or consulting costs. And they're building their own networks of individuals that they could use and reuse from time to time. And the research we've done with the State of Independence over the last 10 years, most freelancers say they would prefer to have about a handful to a dozen clients. So think about that. I mean, you could manage, you could work across, throughout the year for a handful of different companies. Companies would reuse you. You pretty much fractionalized your, diversified your income stream. You get more experience. You get to choose who you want to work for. If one of those clients go out of business or leaves, you still got, 80% of your income protected. And companies are feeling the same way. They want this flexible workforce. They need to be very agile, and having a community of freelancers that they could directly count on, that they're familiar with, that they know that are vetted, that could do the work that they need, like you just said, that's a big motivation. And it's actually a huge trend.
Yeah, and Gene, just so that you freelancers understand what it technically looks like in the background, is literally there's data and there's algorithms that are saying this person has done X amount of projects within this org, and so this other org is most likely to work with them. Which the bad news is it does the little pie at the top gets more money, but you as the freelancer, if you can get into that, which is why every platform says top 1%, if you could get into their existing talent pool, life's a lot better than it would be if you weren't.
Yeah, Matthew, I wanted to ask you, since you've got this background with leading Microsoft Solution the last couple of years, what does this mean for hiring agencies and companies? I think most of us are just thinking of it since we're freelancers from the freelancer's point of view, but I'd like to look at it from the company's point of view as well. Looking at California, what happened there with them not hiring freelancers there, what do you think companies would do or could do in response to the PRO Act if it does go through as it's written?
Yeah, so the immediate impact is that they go and they talk to Gene, right, Gene? They go and they talk to you and they say, how do we make sure we don't get in trouble? And then Gene says, here's X, Y, and Z, and this cost efficiency that was 50 to 90% is going to turn into only 30 to 50%, and the time to hire that was 1 to 2 days is going to turn into 5 to 10, which is still revolutionary better than an agency or full-time. So that's like the immediate one. The secondary, though, is they're going to rely on less freelancers and they're going to go to the ones that they already work with. So Gene is going to say, I can promise you a 4.9 out of 5 if you use these top 50 freelancers. And these top 50 freelancers are going to scale just like an agency, meaning they're going to have networks to refer to and create teams for. So those are the two immediate impacts is They go straight to the platform or the advisory layer. And then second, they stick with the freelancers that they like.
I would add, from a business perspective, I think it's so important to look at both sides, right? So Evan and I are both part of an organization called the Coalition for Workforce Innovation, and we have so many companies inside of this, the association, the group that we put together, that are wanting to do the right thing. They are very adamant about doing the right thing. They're passionate about doing the right thing. And I look at an experience I just had. I needed to hire several people for a project. And I look at the diversity of the workers that I had available to me. And I'll be honest with you, not a single worker came from my immediate locale. They all came from a variety of areas because they had the skill sets that I needed. And the other thing that this would do, and it bothers me because it would step us backwards, I think, in terms of our whole goal as a nation for diversity, inclusion, and equity. And to that, though, Evan, I was wondering if you could maybe spend a minute talking about how, I want to back up to Jean's point, this is very financially driven. And so when we look at this, a lot of this is driven by IRS law, when realistically, this should be a Department of Labor issue. And I don't know, Evan, if you want to maybe mention something about that. I think it's really important to understand the parties at play.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we are part of a group called CWI, and its mission is to educate policymakers, and it's a lobbying organization. So many of the organizations are trade associations or entities that are interested to affect federal public policy. And I think I did just see a question, isn't this all about benefits and negotiating power? And that's really a lot about what it is, right? And I think there is a misconception about what independent workers want broadly. And the PRO Act is the wrong approach to a misguided problem or a misdiagnosed problem, I guess. From what we know, CWI's research, many independent workers have access to the benefits that they want at any given time, but there is a need for a more formalized structure, perhaps, to access benefits through different points of contact, whether it's through the organization that is using your services, or whether it's through an association, or whether it's through public-private partnerships like an ACA marketplace. I think that the idea is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. As Jean mentioned, we can't create a one-size-fits-all approach in 2021 when people want different things at different times. So CWI's mission is to sort of create this, a solution to affirm and promote independent work, but work on sort of those perceived negatives around access to benefits and protections. I think organizing is a separate issue, because the PRO Act is about organizing independent workers, when in fact independent workers, inherently don't want to be part of a union probably. So I think, again, misdiagnosing an issue. But I think, there's a small percentage of loud rideshare drivers perhaps that have been pushing for that, but the vast majority, as we know, of freelancers, of independent workers, have no interest in joining the AFL-CIO or the SEIU or whatever union. And that's, again, part of the message that CWI puts forward is like, let's understand what independent work is, what independent workers want, and structure a policy to fit that, not trying to fit the PRO Act on top of something that doesn't need it.
And Evan, does it also, the law tries to stop the exploitation of, say, an Amazon for underpaying its workers, which is so behind the times, because if you actually were a freelancer, you'd know that you're part of these remote groups and that you communicate your rates. So everyone knows. Like this morning, we had a freelancer in Spain that realized she was charging 7x under what she should have. Why aren't we diving deep into remote work technologies to have freelancers have more access and transparency to things like rates? Instead, we're sitting back making a law saying that we're going to give the power back to, the people that already didn't have transparency in that.
Yeah, I think the biggest competitor, Matthew, to unions is the access of information that individuals have about the market that they live in, about the options they could work. I mean, you could go to Indeed, you could go to any platform, you could go to so many sites and say, look, there's a job that would pay me 30% more an hour. I think in an individual example like Amazon, and Amazon's not a member of RELA, so I don't happen to defend them, but the voters overwhelmingly rejected the union in that case, 2-1. So Amazon was doing something correct. And I do think it's up to employers to offer a value add, to offer good wages, to offer benefits, to offer what people want, because people have the opportunity to seek out information and to find those opportunities elsewhere at a much greater clip now than ever before, and certainly greater than they had in 1936.
Yeah, the number one word, if there was to be a word cloud in the research we've done with over 30,000 people, is control. It comes out over and over again that they do this because they want control. And just to give the voice to some of the people that need protections, there are it ranges anywhere from 12 to 19% of the people that we surveyed that they were forced into independent work. And people that were forced into independent work, they if they don't like it, they need the protections, and they shouldn't be, there could be a race to the bottom for those types of what I would call undifferentiated type of work. As opposed to people that are, doing some type of creative work or differentiated, and it's really about, the talent. They generally have lots of choices. But, there is a segment, and unfortunately, those are the ones you hear about that are probably being, abused and need benefits that they can't get, and it's a kind of a race. They're not having the information. I think would really help to give them the choice. But, for the most part, overwhelmingly, over 80% consistently over the past 10 years, people are doing this because they choose to, because they want the control. And they would totally reject, being forced into some type of arrangement.
So we talked about, what could companies or agencies do, hiring companies or agencies do if this bill goes past as proposed. So a follow-up question has to be, what can our viewers or freelancers do if it goes through as written? Is it something where, we can educate our potential clients on questions or concerns they may have? I see we've got in the chat here, somebody's asking, is there a type of form that can be created for clearance of project work with businesses that would be legal and submitted with tax payments of the freelancer? Like, I guess the question is how can we be proactive on the PRO Act?
Well, I would say be proactive in pushing back with your elected officials that it should be passed at all. Unfortunately, the bill as written did pass the House of Representatives about a month or so ago. Very close vote, very party line vote. This isn't a partisan comment. It just was carried by the Democratic majority in the House. There were a few Republicans that voted for it, one Democrat that voted against it. In the Senate, there are 47 co-sponsors. The latest was Joe Manchin of West Virginia, just co-sponsored it yesterday. All of those co-sponsors happen to be Democrats. And there's 3 Democrats that have not co-sponsored it thus far. And I would say they need to hear from the legion of freelancers across the country, but specifically in their state. And the senators that are still not co-sponsors that should hear from you all are Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, Mark Kelly from Arizona, and Mark Warner of Virginia. And if you are from those states, make it known to them, write a letter to the office, go visit the district office and say, that you oppose the bill and you do not want them to support it. Because right now it's very close to having a majority of senators that support it. And so we are actively educating the Senate right now.
And
Evan, if I could add too, sorry, Zell, you go.
Okay, just real quick, just as a side note too, maybe we can provide the link, Evan. There is a website that was created for independent worker testimonials for this reason. And you have an opportunity to submit your comments there and your stories there of how this would affect you. And part of that is in response to being asked for more commentary from the Department of Labor. So it's being heard. They're trying to listen. We just need to be more vocal about that.
Wow, let's get that website out.
For sure.
And if I could add too, from some clarity, talk about the stories. because I think a lot of times what happens, especially with leadership, is that they get so bogged down in the details, but let's make it human, because the stories we have in terms of how the freelance economy has helped these individuals are incredible. From, parents that their kid kept getting, out of school because of a mental illness or something like that couldn't work a full-time job, to people having to take care of their parents and not being able to work a full-time job. I mean, we need to get these stories out there so that people realize this is not either a bunch of ride-sharing drivers, and one other thing is that B, this is more than just writers. Now, there's a huge throng of writers, which is incredible, but we also need to go beyond and say, okay, this is more than just this one sector. This is designers, this is developers, Gen Z, millennials, over 50% of them are jumping in. And so the stories and the diversity of skills is what we really need the public to see.
It was one of the
Evan,
best pieces of the Department of Labor's final rule that they finished. Sorry, Gene, I know you were very involved in this as well, so please chime in. When they finished that rule in January, there was hundreds of comments from individual workers that I think were the most powerful advocacy for it. And I know, Gene, you were very involved in that, so I apologies for jumping in there.
No. I was just going to ask, how can we tell people that are listening to this and promote further, what else can be done to share those stories like Matthew was just talking about, and the website that Azaria has. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. I didn't realize that the vote was that close at this point with Manchin yesterday. I know Mark Warner is against this. I've met with him a couple of times. He gets it, but it's pretty close.
I wanted to add something that's a little bit different, and it's something for consideration. So a couple of years ago, we tossed around the idea of independent workers, contractors, freelancers, gig workers coming together and creating a social contract. And what I mean by that is, why do we need an organizing group to tell us how we do our work? So what if we as a collective came together and wrote a social contract between businesses and independent workers stating how we'll work with them and how they'll work with us ethically? And then, that's something I would be willing to head up if I had assistance with that too. And then to Gene's point, I think the other thing is, and this is something we've been working on as well, we are looking at authorized credentialing so that independent workers have an authorized credential that is, tokenized, so these companies don't have to go through a bunch of work to find out who the workers are. And I think that, I know, Gene, you've been talking about that for years, but I'm with you. I think it's time to bring that forward. Let's make this so you have an official stamp, like this is who you are, this is what you do. And if you are making that choice, then choose to be independent and not let that choice be taken away from you. I think that's the biggest thing we need to take away from this is the PRO Act would essentially take away your choice. And I think from a psychological perspective, all of the research that I've been looking at, that is so detrimental to the independent workforce, because these is a group of people who choose to be independent for a reason. And from a psychological perspective, you have to look at how that would impact the workforce in terms of productivity, morale, optimism, hope, efficacy. All of those things would be negatively impacted. And what does that do to our nation?
So we've got a question in the chat here. Can you send out a form letter that we can use, or give us the points we should cover? Anybody got anything already typed up that they could share and we could send on to our viewers here?
Yeah.
So yes, so I think if you check out the site, which is a portal for individuals to make testimonial videos, there's sort of a script or sort of a prompt that will ask a question, and just sort of you can respond to that. We want it to be very organic and not a script, but that's a good way to do it. On the website, I think will also be shared that the CW group that iWorker and RELA are part of, if you check out advocacy, you'll see the letters that we've drafted to the Congress about the PRO Act and some other issues. So I encourage everybody to check out the resources. Pretty much everything we've done as a group is on the site, and it's open, and I encourage everybody to take a look, and always happy to follow up directly with anybody who wants to get involved.
And that's the stories.workforceinnovation.net.
Yes, I couldn't figure out how to share it with everybody else. So.
I got you, not to worry. So we know we've got to contact our representatives. We've got to organize somehow. I'm curious, there's Freelancers Union out in New York. We've got the Freelance Exchange in Kansas City. Now, we're not exactly a union. Texas has the Freelance Association. Atlanta's got Freelance Forum. There's different freelance groups around the country. So I'm curious, is this something that we should look at maybe bonding together, having one sort of membership, if you will, to give us that credential? Like if you are a member of your local chapter, then you also get these credentials nationwide. And then therefore you're exempt from this, being affected by this law. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, I'll start.
So
let me see. So actually, back in 2017, we did our first policy conference in Washington, D.C. on this very issue. And so after that point, Dr. Carl Camden, former CEO of Kelly Services, we founded what's called IPSA-US, the Association of Independent Workers. What I will say about that is that conceptually, it's phenomenal. The issue, and this is why we need you guys to step up, is because in any association like that, 100% of your members expect you to do advocacy work, but less than 10% are actually involved. So what I would say to that is, it's good in theory, but in application, we need to step up and actually do that. And it's hard to get like a huge collective like that because so many different of the work verticals have their own associations that people are already part of. So I think there's a solution, but I'm not sure how we would organize that. So you guys wave your magic wand and let me know.
So Gina, I'd love to hear your take on this, especially because I think it comes down to incentives. Because if you look at freelance marketplaces, they are not incented to care about you. What I mean by that is that they're a dual-sided marketplace and there's this much spend and there's this many freelancers. So they really don't care how you do. They just care that that tiny little bit of spend can be serviced within 24 hours. And there's plenty of them. And so my huge recommendation is that we have to step up our game so that this turns into this on both sides, so that if companies and marketplaces, do this, they're incented to care about both of us. And that's the biggest problem that I see. And you see this every 5 years. There's a new player that comes up saying they're for freelancers by freelancers. But then within 5 years, they turn and they're just clients or they're just union. And so that's why, Gene, I'll give you the floor because you're the master at this.
Well, thank you. But our DNA has always been about the independent worker. And, the name of the company actually was called My Biz Office because it was your business office. And, now it's MBO. But I agree with Matthew. You hit it, directly on. I think, companies have a lot of spend, right? So they tend to, kind of take control. We need I think more and more, as individuals are able to promote themselves, which is getting easier and easier to do online now. And I mean, it's about, the high quality talent. Talent is in demand. There is definitely a war for talent today. Especially right now coming out of this pandemic, and more people know to work digitally now to work remote and obviously digitally through without having to get to the office. I do think people that have the skills are going to be able to control who they want to work for. We've got this whole concept of helping companies who want to be competitive because they understand getting talent is important. We tell them you not only need to be an employer of choice, you need to become a client of choice for this new segment of the workforce. And the more that companies do understand that, they are starting to, and I can tell you we're directly involved with it. They're starting to get it. They see they need to actually attract these people and have easier ways for them to work with them. But it's a long haul. So I don't have a really better answer for you, Matthew. But you're right.
Yeah,
All good.
You nailed it with the company side. That we need to make companies a client and not,
Right.
feel like there's no need to care about us.
Yeah.
I'm laughing only because our organizer behind the scenes, Emily Leach, is like, now I want to start the Legion of Freelancers. So I love it. Kudos to her. So we are running out of time here, and I just want to take a moment to thank each of the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules today and joining us for this very enlightening and very, important and informative discussion on the PRO Act. And to our viewers, I want to thank you for tuning in. I encourage you to stay informed, to move forward with intention, impact, and purpose. Until next time, I'm Julie Cortez. Thank you.
Thank you.